Buck Jacob Lowe from Mountain Monsters has been keeping a devastating secret for years. The ATV accident that nearly killed him and left him with permanent injuries wasn't just a routine mishap on familiar trails. It was caused by a terrifying Bigfoot encounter that producers forced him to cover up. For years, Buck has lived with chronic pain, addiction struggles, and the burden of knowing he encountered something real while the show around him faked evidence for ratings. Now, Buck is finally breaking his silence about what really happened that day, why the network buried the truth, and the evidence he's kept hidden that proves his story. The revelation will expose one of the biggest cover-ups in paranormal television history and validate what cryptid hunters have believed all along. Make sure you're subscribed because Buck is about to prove that the most genuine encounter in Mountain Monsters history was the one Travel Channel worked hardest to hide from viewers. Buck Jacob Lowe's social media post dropped like a bomb on the Mountain Monsters fan community in late January 2025. After years of relative silence following his departure from the show, Buck posted a lengthy statement on Facebook that began with words that immediately grabbed attention. "It's time I told you the truth about what really happened to me, and why I can never go back to that mountain again." The post was raw, emotional, and clearly written by someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Buck explained that legal restrictions and non-disclosure agreements had prevented him from speaking openly about his accident, but those restrictions had finally expired, freeing him to share the full story. Within minutes, the post had hundreds of comments from shocked fans demanding details. What truth had Buck been forced to hide? Why were there legal restrictions around what seemed like a simple ATV accident? The cryptic nature of Buck's announcement sparked immediate speculation across paranormal forums, Reddit threads, and YouTube channels. Some fans theorized Buck was finally going to expose Mountain Monsters as completely fake, confessing that everything was scripted and staged. Others wondered if Buck was revealing serious behind-the-scenes conflicts with cast members or production companies. A few perceptive fans noticed Buck's specific phrasing, "what really happened on that mountain," and began speculating that maybe the accident wasn't as straightforward as viewers had been told. Buck followed up his initial post with a promise to reveal everything in a forthcoming video interview, stating he had evidence that will prove what I'm about to tell you and why the network never wanted this story to come out. The mention of evidence intrigued the community even more. What could Buck possibly have that Travel Channel feared? His final comment in that initial post sent chills through longtime Mountain Monsters viewers. "The most real thing that ever happened during all our years hunting cryptids is the thing they made me lie about. The creature that nearly killed me was real, and I'm done protecting people who cared more about their liability than the truth." The cryptid hunting community exploded with theories. Buck was claiming an actual creature encounter, not just another staged investigation, but one that had been covered up rather than celebrated. This contradicted everything fans thought they knew about his accident. Buck's detailed account of what happened that September afternoon in 2018 reads like something from a horror film, but he insists every word is true and he has evidence to prove it. Buck was riding his ATV on private property adjacent to where Mountain Monsters frequently filmed, an area he'd traversed hundreds of times over decades of living in Appalachia. He knew every trail, every turn, and every potential hazard on that land. What he didn't expect was to encounter a massive bipedal creature standing in a clearing approximately 75 yards ahead of him. Buck initially thought it was a person, maybe a hunter or hiker who'd wandered onto private land, but as he slowed his ATV and got a clearer view, he realized this was something else entirely. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall with dark brown hair covering its entire body except for its face, which Buck describes as a horrifying mix of human and ape features. The smell hit him next, a putrid, musky odor that made his eyes water even from that distance. Buck sat frozen on his idling ATV for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, trying to process what he was seeing. The creature noticed him. It turned its massive head, made direct eye contact with Buck, and released a vocalization that Buck describes as the most terrifying sound he'd ever heard. A combination of roar and scream that seemed impossibly loud and resonated in his chest. Then it charged. The creature moved with shocking speed for something so large, covering the distance between them faster than seemed physically possible. Buck reacted on pure instinct, twisting the throttle and attempting to turn the ATV around to flee back down the trail. In his panic and the desperate need for speed on rough terrain, Buck lost control. The ATV hit a large rock, partially hidden in tall grass, sending Buck airborne before slamming him into the ground and rolling the vehicle over his lower back and legs. He remembers the immediate explosion of pain, the inability to move his legs, and the terrifying realization that the creature was still somewhere nearby. Buck could hear it crashing through the brush, circling his position, apparently curious about what had happened but maintaining distance from the wrecked ATV. Buck lay in agony for nearly 20 minutes before help arrived, unable to move and terrified the creature would return. A family member who'd heard the ATV crash found him and called emergency services. Buck tried explaining what had chased him, but in his injured, traumatized state, his rescuers assumed he was confused or hallucinating from pain. By the time paramedics arrived and transported Buck to the hospital, word had already reached Mountain Monsters producers that one of their cast members had been seriously injured. The medical diagnosis was devastating: multiple fractured vertebrae, severe herniated discs, and nerve damage that would require immediate surgery and months of rehabilitation with no guarantee of full recovery. While Buck was still in the hospital recovering from emergency spinal surgery, he received visits from Travel Channel executives and production company lawyers that he describes as more interrogation than wellness check. They asked detailed questions about exactly what had happened, whether anyone else witnessed the encounter, and crucially, whether Buck had captured any video or photographic evidence of the creature. When Buck explained that he'd encountered a Bigfoot that charged him causing the accident, the lawyer's demeanor immediately shifted. They explained very clearly that Buck could not, under any circumstances, publicly claim his accident was caused by a cryptid encounter. The reasons were legal and financial. Without video evidence proving a creature was present, Buck's claim was legally just an allegation that could expose the production company and network to massive liability. If Buck was injured by an actual dangerous animal on a location where Mountain Monsters had been filming, it raised questions about whether proper safety protocols had been followed and whether the production had knowingly put cast members in danger. Insurance companies would investigate, lawsuits could follow, and the show itself might be canceled if it was determined that cryptid hunting posed genuine safety risks that weren't being properly managed. Buck was presented with revised non-disclosure agreements that specifically prohibited him from discussing the circumstances of his accident beyond describing it as a routine ATV mishap. If he violated these terms, he would be immediately removed from the show, forfeit any future compensation, and potentially face legal action for breach of contract. Buck, vulnerable and medicated in a hospital bed, signed the agreements under duress. Buck's recovery from spinal surgery required powerful prescription opioids to manage the excruciating pain that became his constant companion. Doctors prescribed OxyContin, Percocet, and eventually fentanyl patches for pain that simply wouldn't subside even months after the accident. What began as legitimate medical treatment for serious injuries gradually transformed into dependency that Buck didn't recognize until it had completely taken over his life. The pain from his injuries was real and debilitating, but Buck found himself taking pills not just for physical relief, but to numb the psychological trauma of the Bigfoot encounter and the guilt of lying about what had really happened. Every time someone asked about his accident and Buck repeated the rehearsed story about hitting a rock on a familiar trail, he felt like a fraud. The pills helped silence that voice of shame temporarily. Buck admits he began taking more than prescribed, convincing himself that the extra doses were medically necessary, when in reality, he was chasing the euphoric escape the medications provided from both physical and emotional agony. When doctors tried to reduce his prescriptions as healing progressed, Buck doctor shopped to maintain his supply, visiting multiple physicians and pharmacies to obtain overlapping prescriptions. He became skilled at manipulating medical professionals, exaggerating symptoms, and playing up his injuries to justify continued high-dose opioid therapy long after it was medically appropriate. The addiction affected his behavior during Mountain Monsters filming in ways that crew members noticed but production largely ignored. Buck would show up to investigations visibly impaired, slurring words, moving with the slow deliberateness of someone heavily medicated. There were moments captured on camera where Buck seemed confused or disconnected, staring blankly while other cast members discussed investigation strategies. Editors worked around his worst moments, cutting scenes where Buck's impairment was too obvious to hide. Other cast members confronted Buck privately about showing up to dangerous nighttime investigations in the woods while clearly under the influence of something. The concerns were both personal. They cared about Buck's well-being, and practical. An impaired team member put everyone at risk during investigations in rough terrain and potentially dangerous situations. Buck became defensive and denied having any problem, insisting he was only taking prescribed medications for legitimate injuries. The intervention finally finally came when Buck's family discovered the extent of his addiction after finding multiple pill bottles from different doctors and pharmacies hidden throughout his home. The decision to cover up Buck's Bigfoot encounter was calculated and deliberate, driven by legal liability concerns that overwhelmed any consideration of honoring what may have been a genuine cryptid experience. Travel Channel's insurance policies for Mountain Monsters covered injuries sustained during normal production activities, slips, falls, equipment accidents, and other predictable hazards of filming in wilderness locations. But injuries caused by actual dangerous wildlife or cryptid creatures opened an entirely different legal nightmare that insurers explicitly excluded from coverage. If Buck's encounter was real and the network acknowledged it, they'd be admitting that Mountain Monsters cast members faced genuine danger from creatures the show was supposedly investigating. This would trigger immediate insurance investigations, potential policy cancellations, and liability exposure worth millions if Buck or other cast members filed injury lawsuits claiming inadequate safety protocols. Production companies and networks maintain detailed safety procedures for reality television, including wildlife protocols, location assessments, and emergency response plans. Acknowledging that a cast member was attacked by an unknown creature would reveal that all those safety procedures were inadequate for the actual risks involved. Regulatory agencies, including OSHA, could investigate whether proper workplace safety standards were being followed. State film commissions might revoke permits for future productions. The legal department's worst-case scenario involved Buck's encounter becoming public and inspiring other cast or crew members to come forward with their own cryptid experiences that had been downplayed or ignored. If a pattern emerged of genuine dangerous encounters being covered up while the show simultaneously marketed itself as documenting real cryptid investigations, the network faced potential fraud claims from viewers and advertisers. Lawsuits alleging deceptive business practices could expose the show's scripted elements and staged evidence to legal scrutiny. Beyond liability, there was a cynical calculation about credibility. Mountain Monsters had been accused for years of faking evidence and staging encounters. If Buck came forward claiming a real Bigfoot attack caused his accident, skeptics would assume it was just another publicity stunt to boost ratings. The story seemed too convenient. A cast member of a cryptid hunting show just happens to have a genuine encounter off camera with no footage to prove it. Critics would mock the claim mercilessly, potentially doing more damage to the show's reputation than simply saying nothing. The network decided that silence was the safest option legally, financially, and reputationally. John Trapper Tice was one of the few people Buck confided in about what really happened, and Trapper's reaction revealed a man deeply conflicted about what Mountain Monsters had become versus what he'd originally envisioned. Buck reached out to Trapper while still recovering in the hospital, needing to talk with someone who would understand both the magnitude of encountering a real cryptid and the complicated position the network had put him in. Trapper listened to Buck's account without interruption, then said something Buck will never forget. "I believe you completely, and I'm sorry this happened to you in more ways than one." Trapper explained that he'd had his own unexplained encounters over years of genuinely hunting cryptids in Appalachia, long before television got involved. He'd seen things he couldn't explain, heard vocalizations that didn't match any known animal, and found evidence that convinced him something unknown lived in those mountains. But he'd also watched Mountain Monsters transform from a show about legitimate investigation into something increasingly staged and scripted to meet network demands for dramatic content. Trapper was furious that producers were forcing Buck to hide a genuine encounter while simultaneously faking evidence for episodes. The hypocrisy disgusted him. The one real cryptid experience that could validate everything they'd been claiming was being buried for legal and financial reasons, while manufactured drama was presented as authentic investigation. Trapper confronted producers about the Buck situation, arguing they should find a way to tell his story that respected both the truth and legitimate legal concerns. The network refused, and Trapper's relationship with production became increasingly strained. In private conversations during Buck's recovery period, Trapper shared his own regrets about how the show had evolved. He felt complicit in deceiving fans who genuinely believed in their work, and the Buck situation crystallized his concerns about the ethical problems inherent in paranormal entertainment television. Trapper encouraged Buck to prioritize his health and well-being over the show, even if that meant walking away entirely. He offered to support Buck publicly if he ever decided to tell the truth, regardless of consequences from the network. Those conversations meant everything to Buck during his darkest period. Trapper's death, less than a year later, hit Buck especially hard because he'd lost not just a team leader, but the one person who fully understood and validated his experience. Buck's secret about the Bigfoot encounter created a fracture within the Ames team that never fully healed, dividing cast members between those who believed his story and supported him versus those who thought he was lying or exaggerating for attention and sympathy. The division started almost immediately after Buck returned to filming following his recovery. He confided in select team members about what had really happened, hoping for understanding and support from people he'd worked alongside for years. Wild Bill was among the first Buck told, and his reaction was unexpectedly harsh. Wild Bill expressed skepticism about the encounter, suggesting that Buck's pain medications and trauma had caused him to misinterpret what he'd seen. He pointed out that convenient off-camera encounters without evidence were exactly the kind of thing skeptics accused the show of fabricating. Wild Bill's dismissal felt like betrayal to Buck, who'd expected his longtime friend to believe him unconditionally. Their relationship deteriorated from that point, with Buck feeling unsupported during the most difficult period of his life, while Wild Bill felt Buck was being irresponsible by spreading unprovable claims that could damage the show's credibility. The argument escalated into accusations about who was really loyal to the team and whether Buck's addiction issues were affecting his judgment about what had actually happened. Other cast members took sides. Willy believed Buck's story completely, having had his own unexplained experiences in Appalachian wilderness that he'd never shared publicly. Willy became one of Buck's strongest advocates, arguing that the team should support Buck rather than question him. Jeff was more neutral, acknowledging he didn't know what happened but felt the network's handling of the situation was wrong, regardless of whether Buck's encounter was real. The division went beyond just believing or disbelieving Buck's story. It exposed deeper tensions about the show's authenticity and what the cast owed each other versus what they owed the production. Some cast members prioritized protecting Mountain Monsters' reputation and their own financial interests, viewing Buck's story as a liability that could jeopardize everyone's paychecks if it went public. Others felt that loyalty to a team member who was genuinely suffering should outweigh business concerns. Filming became awkward and tense, with unresolved conflicts simmering beneath every investigation. Buck felt increasingly isolated, dealing with chronic pain and addiction while surrounded by people who either didn't believe him or wanted him to stay quiet for the good of the show. What producers and cast members didn't know was that Buck had collected physical evidence from the encounter site that he'd kept hidden for years, waiting for the right time to reveal proof that would validate his story. In the chaotic aftermath of his accident, while waiting for emergency responders, Buck used his phone to photograph massive footprints he could see from where he lay injured on the ground. The prints were approximately 18 inches long, deeply impressed in the soft earth near where the creature had been standing, showing clear toe definition and dermal ridges that Buck knew were consistent with alleged Bigfoot tracks documented by researchers. He took over a dozen photos from different angles despite excruciating pain, knowing these images might be his only evidence of what had really happened. Buck also recorded audio on his phone during those terrifying 20 minutes before help arrived. The recording captures his labored breathing, groans of pain, and most importantly, distant vocalizations from the creature that had apparently remained in the area after Buck crashed. The sounds are deep, guttural, and unlike any known wildlife in West Virginia. Audio analysis experts Buck later consulted privately confirmed the vocalizations didn't match bear, elk, or any other animal native to Appalachia. Before emergency crews arrived, Buck managed to crawl several feet to collect physical evidence. Tufts of dark hair caught on vegetation where the creature had crashed through the brush. He stuffed the hair samples into his jacket pocket, protecting them even as paramedics worked on him. Buck had the samples analyzed by a private laboratory under a false name, paying cash to avoid any paper trail that might alert producers. The lab results showed primate hair with characteristics inconsistent with any known ape species, though the lab couldn't definitively identify the source. The most compelling evidence Buck preserved was the actual location data and timestamps from his phone proving exactly when and where the encounter occurred. GPS coordinates, photo metadata, and cell tower records document his position at the time of the accident, allowing independent verification that he was exactly where he claimed to be. Buck kept all this evidence hidden for years, stored in a secure location known only to his closest family members, waiting until he was legally free to reveal it without violating his non-disclosure agreements with the network. Buck's decision to permanently leave Mountain Monsters and finally reveal the truth about his Bigfoot encounter represents a complete transformation from the person who once prioritized television fame and paychecks over personal integrity. His journey through addiction recovery provided the clarity and courage necessary to walk away from the show and face the consequences of telling a story the network desperately wants to remain buried. Buck completed his final contracted episodes in 2023 while counting down the days until his non-disclosure agreements would expire. Every moment of filming felt dishonest and unbearable now that he'd achieved sobriety and could no longer use substances to numb the guilt of lying about his experience. He watched producers stage evidence and script encounters while sitting on proof of a genuine cryptid interaction that was being actively suppressed. The hypocrisy became too much to tolerate. In early 2025, when his legal restrictions finally expired, Buck made the definitive choice to tell his story regardless of professional and financial consequences. He's prepared for lawsuits from the network claiming he's violating the spirit of his agreements even if technically legal restrictions have lapsed. He's accepted that speaking out means he'll never work in paranormal television again and that many people will dismiss his claims as attention-seeking fabrication. But Buck has come to believe that his recovery and continued sobriety depend on living authentically and telling the truth about what happened to him. The lies were literally making him sick, contributing to depression and anxiety that threatened his hard-won sobriety. Buck's plans for revealing his evidence are deliberate and strategic. He's partnering with credible Bigfoot researchers and wildlife biologists to analyze and present his photos, audio recordings, and physical samples in a way that withstands scientific scrutiny. He's considering publishing a book that tells the complete story of his encounter, the network cover-up, and his struggle with addiction and recovery. Most importantly, Buck wants his story to validate other people who've had genuine cryptid encounters but remained silent due to fear of ridicule or professional consequences. He hopes that by coming forward with evidence and accepting the personal costs of honesty, he can encourage others to share their experiences and contribute to legitimate cryptozoological research rather than entertainment television's staged fakery. Mountain Monsters ran for 8 seasons on Destination America and Travel Channel. The Ames team, Trapper, Buck, Huckleberry, Jeffro, Willy, and Wild Bill, became some of the most beloved personalities in paranormal television history. Then Trapper died. And what happened to the rest of the team in the years since? The grief, the struggles, the financial realities, and the personal costs of a show whose end left 6 men without the framework that had defined their lives, is the story nobody has fully told. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Mountain Monsters was never really about monsters. The creatures, the Mothman, the Grafton Monster, the Wood Booger, the Shadow Creature, were the premise around which the show organized its investigations. But what the audience came back for season after season was not the creature hunt, it was the men conducting it. The Ames team, the Appalachian investigators of mysterious sightings, represented something that paranormal television had never previously produced in quite the same form. Not a group of scientific researchers applying methodological frameworks to anomalous evidence. Not a team of professional investigators whose credentials gave their findings institutional credibility. A family. 6 men from the Appalachian region whose relationships to each other preceded the show and whose collective personality, the humor, the loyalty, the specific quality of warmth that the mountain communities they came from produces in the people it shapes, gave the production something that no casting process or production format could manufacture. John Richard Tice, Trapper, was the patriarch of that family in every sense that the word communicates beyond its biological meaning. He was the team's founder, its leader, its moral center, and its most irreplaceable personality. His combination of practical mountain wisdom, deadpan humor, and the specific quality of quiet authority that the people who grew up around men like him recognize immediately gave the show its tone and its soul. At 72 years old, after 8 seasons of leading his team through the mountains of the Appalachian wilderness in pursuit of creatures whose existence the investigation never definitively confirmed, and whose pursuit was always secondary to the experience of watching these men pursue it together, John Richard Tice died of kidney failure on December 16, 2019. He was surrounded by his family. The show had been his. The team had been his, and what the team became in the years after his death, how each of the men who had built their professional and personal identities around the Ames operation navigated the specific grief and the specific dislocation that losing Trapper produced, is the chapter of the Mountain Monsters story that the broadcast record has never told, and that the audience that fell in love with the Ames team across 8 seasons deserves to understand fully. John Richard Tice's death on December 16, 2019 did not simply remove the most beloved personality from a paranormal television production. It removed the organizing center of 6 men's professional and personal lives. The figure whose presence had given the Ames team its identity, its direction, and the specific quality of coherence that the audience experienced as the show's most essential characteristic across 8 seasons of Appalachian creature investigation. The grief that Trapper's death produced in the remaining team members was not the professional loss of colleagues whose working relationship had been organized around a shared employer. It was the grief of men who had lost a father figure, whose relationship to the person who died was built on the kind of sustained, genuine, mutually invested connection that the Appalachian community's culture of loyalty and long-term relationship produces in ways that the outside world does not always fully register. Buck, Jacob Lowe, was the youngest member of the team and the one whose relationship to Trapper had the most explicitly paternal character. He had been the team's most energetic field presence across 8 seasons, his enthusiasm and his physical capability in the Appalachian terrain giving the investigations a momentum that Trapper's leadership directed and shaped. What Trapper's death produced in Jacob Lowe, in a young man whose professional identity had been built in the context of a relationship whose loss removed the framework that identity was organized around, is the chapter of his post-show story whose specific personal dimension the people who know him have been most careful about in their public communications. Huckleberry, Joseph Lott, whose background as a retired Marine had given the team its security presence and whose quiet, steady reliability had made him one of the most trusted members of the Ames operation, processed Trapper's death with the specific quality of military discipline that his background had built into his response to loss. A composure whose public face has not always reflected the private dimension of what losing the team's patriarch produced in a man whose adult life had been organized around loyalty to the people he served alongside. Jeffro, Willy, and Wild Bill each carried the loss in the specific ways that their individual relationships to Trapper and to the team's collective identity had shaped, and each has navigated the post-show years in the context of that loss in ways whose full accounting the broadcast record of the seasons that followed Trapper's death has not provided. Jacob Lowe, Buck, was handed something when Trapper died that no amount of preparation across 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters had fully equipped him to carry. Not the show's leadership in the institutional sense of a production role whose responsibilities were formally transferred. The weight of being the person the team looked to in the absence of the person they had always looked to. The specific, unasked for, unavoidable weight of being the youngest member of a family-like team who finds himself in the position of the eldest after the eldest is gone. He was in his early 30s when Trapper died. He had spent the preceding years building his professional identity as the Ames team's most energetic field investigator, the caller, the tracker, the physical presence in the Appalachian wilderness whose combination of mountain knowledge and genuine enthusiasm gave the show some of its most compelling investigation moments. He had never been positioned, by the team's dynamic or by the show's production format, as the successor to Trapper's leadership role. The succession was not planned. It was not chosen. It was produced by circumstance in the specific and inescapable way that the death of the irreplaceable always produces succession in the people who remain. What Buck did with that weight in the years following Trapper's death is the chapter of his post-Mountain Monsters story whose specific character the Sons of Appalachia YouTube channel, the independent production he launched alongside Huckleberry and Wild Bill after the show's conclusion, partially documents without fully representing. The channel gave the 3 men a platform for continuing the investigation work that Mountain Monsters had organized their lives around, without the production infrastructure that the Travel Channel relationship had provided. It gave Buck a professional context for the leadership that Trapper's death had left without an occupant, and it gave the audience that had followed Mountain Monsters across 8 seasons a way of maintaining their relationship with the team members whose personal appeal had been the show's most fundamental asset. What it did not give Buck, what the Sons of Appalachia channel's independent production format could not replicate, was the institutional support, the production resources, and the audience scale that the Mountain Monsters broadcast relationship had provided. Starting over as an independent content creator at 30-something, carrying the grief of Trapper's death and the weight of the team's expectations, is the specific starting over whose cost the Sons of Appalachia channel's cheerful presentation has never fully represented. When the Mountain Monsters Ames team navigated the specific fracture that Trapper's death and the show's eventual conclusion produced in the collective it had been, the paths its members took in the aftermath were not uniform. Buck, Huckleberry, and Wild Bill chose the Sons of Appalachia path, the independent YouTube channel whose continuation of the investigation format gave their post-show professional lives a direction and a platform. Jeff Headley, Jeffro, and Willy made different choices whose specific character reflects both their individual personalities and the specific ways that 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters had intersected with the professional and personal dimensions of their lives outside the production. Jeffro, the team's researcher and technology specialist, the man whose antique shop in West Virginia had given his professional identity a foundation that predated the show and would outlast it, returned to the life that Mountain Monsters had organized around rather than replaced. His antique business, his community connections, the specific satisfactions of a life in the Appalachian region, whose roots go deeper than any television production's tenure, and whose continuity the post-show years have allowed him to return to in a form that the production schedule's demands had consistently interrupted. The return has not been without its complications. 8 seasons of national television exposure changes a person's relationship to their community and to their professional environment in ways that the return to pre-show normalcy does not simply reverse. The audience recognition, the community expectations, and the specific quality of being known in a way that the show created, rather than that the ordinary course of a life in a small Appalachian community produces. All of it shapes the post-show experience in ways that Jeffro's public communications have not fully addressed. Willy, the trap builder, the co-founder of the Ames operation, the man whose practical construction skills gave the investigations their physical infrastructure across 8 seasons, returned to the arborist work that had been his professional foundation before the cameras arrived. The physical work, the trees, the specific satisfaction of skilled manual labor whose relationship to the Appalachian landscape he grew up in gave his professional identity a grounding that the television production had never replaced. What the return to that life after 8 seasons of national television exposure costs a man whose personality the audience had come to know and whose ordinariness the show's production had made extraordinary is the question whose answer the post-show years have been writing in the specific terms of what Willy daily life looks like in 2026. Joseph Lott, Huckleberry, and William Neff, Wild Bill, represent the dimension of the Mountain Monsters post-show story, whose specific character is most directly shaped by the specific quality of loyalty that the Appalachian culture both men came from builds into its people as a foundational value rather than a situational virtue. When Buck needed people to stand beside him in the aftermath of Trapper's death and in the construction of the Sons of Appalachia project that represented the team's continuation in a new form, Huckleberry and Wild Bill were the ones who stood there. Not because the professional calculation made it the obvious choice. The Sons of Appalachia YouTube channel's independent production format offers a fraction of the resources and the audience reach that the Mountain Monsters broadcast relationship had provided. Because loyalty in the specific Appalachian sense of the word does not make professional calculations. It shows up. Huckleberry's background as a retired Marine, whose 6 years of service had built into his character the specific quality of commitment to the people you serve alongside that military culture produces at its best, made his presence beside Buck in the post-show years the expression of something deeper than professional solidarity. He had stood beside Trapper for 8 seasons. He stood beside Buck after Trapper was gone. The consistency is not accidental. It is the expression of a value whose application to the specific circumstances the post-show years produced was as automatic as it had been during the Mountain Monsters seasons. Wild Bill, William Neff, whose 6 years of Marine Corps service and whose reputation as the team's most skilled tracker gave his Mountain Monsters presence a specific and irreplaceable quality, brought the same loyalty to the Sons of Appalachia project with the practical field expertise that the investigation format required. What both men have absorbed in terms of the personal cost of that loyalty, the professional opportunities that the commitment to the Sons of Appalachia channel has not pursued, the financial realities of an independent content creation operation whose resources are a fraction of what the broadcast relationship provided, and the specific personal dimension of sustaining a professional commitment in the grief-shaped aftermath of Trapper's death is the chapter of their post-show story whose full accounting the Sons of Appalachia channel's content has never provided. Mountain Monsters ran for 8 seasons on Destination America and Travel Channel and produced an audience whose loyalty and whose size gave the franchise a commercial value that the network's investment in its continued production across multiple seasons reflected. What it paid the men whose personalities generated that commercial value is the chapter of the show's history that the broadcast format's entertainment presentation has never addressed, and that the post-show financial realities of the Ames team's individual members communicate in the indirect but legible terms of what their lives look like in 2026. Reality television has a documented and well-understood history of distributing the commercial value that its cast members generate in ways that the disproportion between the network's profit margins and the cast's compensation makes visible to anyone who looks at the cast members' post-show financial situations against the backdrop of the show's commercial success. Mountain Monsters was not a show whose cast members' compensation reflected the audience loyalty and the commercial value that their personalities created. The production was regional in its talent base, drawing from the Appalachian community rather than from the entertainment industry's professional talent pool. And the compensation structures that regional reality television applies to cast members whose marketability outside the specific production context is limited by the regional and cultural specificity of their appeal are not the compensation structures that nationally recognized entertainment talent commands. The Ames team members were not nationally recognized entertainment talent in the commercial sense that drives compensation negotiation. They were genuine personalities from genuine backgrounds whose authenticity was the source of their appeal and whose marketability outside the Mountain Monsters context. The network's compensation assessment reflected in terms that the show's commercial success did not proportionally represent. What that means for the financial realities of each team member's life in 2026, the specific economic foundation on which the post-show years have been built, is the dimension of the tragic story this video documents that the show's adventure presentation was most completely designed to not address. The Mountain Monsters broadcast record after Trapper's death, the seasons that continued without him, organized around the team's attempt to maintain the investigation operation that his leadership had built, is a document of grief that the show's entertainment format was not designed to represent honestly, and that the production's obligation to maintain the audience relationship the prior seasons had built did not allow to be represented fully. The team went back into the Appalachian Mountains after Trapper died. They went back with the cameras and the production infrastructure and the creature hunt format that his leadership had established. They went back because the show was the thing he had built, and continuing it was the most direct expression available to them of the loyalty they had built around him across 8 seasons of shared experience. What going back without him cost each of them, the specific experience of conducting the investigations that his presence had always defined in the absence of the presence that had defined them, is the dimension of the post-Trapper seasons whose complete accounting the broadcast record has never provided. The humor was still there in those seasons. The warmth was still there. The specific quality of the Ames team's collective personality that the audience had built its loyalty around was present in the men who continued after Trapper's death in a way that reflected both the genuine resilience of the Appalachian character the show had always celebrated and the genuine effort those men made to honor what he had built by continuing to build it in his absence. What the humor and the warmth were covering, the specific grief that sustained loss of the kind Trapper's death produced, does to the people who carry it across the years of daily life in its aftermath, is the chapter that the post-show years have been writing in the private dimensions of each team member's experience, and that the Sons of Appalachia channel's continuation of the adventure presentation has not been designed to address. Grief of this specific kind, the grief of losing the person whose presence organized the context in which your most significant professional and personal relationships existed, does not resolve on a timeline that the 2026 versions of Buck, Huckleberry, and Wild Bill have fully completed. They are still in it, and the work of continuing. The Sons of Appalachia channel, the investigation format, the Appalachian creature hunt, is the work of men who are doing the most meaningful thing available to them with the grief they are carrying, which is to keep doing what Trapper built in the mountains he loved, with the team he made. In 2026, the members of the Mountain Monsters Ames team are in the specific chapter of their post-show lives, whose character the accumulated weight of everything the preceding parts of this video have established: the grief, the financial realities, the professional dislocation, the personal costs of 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters, followed by Trapper's death, followed by the show's conclusion, has shaped in ways that the straightforward adventure narrative of the broadcast record never prepared anyone to understand. Buck is in his mid-30s. leading the Sons of Appalachia operation with the specific combination of genuine commitment and personal weight that the years since Trapper's death have built into his leadership. The channel produces content whose quality and whose audience loyalty reflect the genuine personality that made him one of Mountain Monsters' most compelling cast members. What it does not produce, what the independent content creation format cannot provide in the absence of the broadcast relationship's resources, is the institutional infrastructure that the Mountain Monsters production gave the investigation work, a foundation it has not had since the show concluded. Huckleberry and Wild Bill are beside him in the Sons of Appalachia operation with the loyalty that their individual characters and their shared history with the team have always produced. Their presence in the post-show continuation is the most direct expression available of what the Ames team was always about. Men from the Appalachian Mountains who show up for each other because showing up is what the culture they came from built into them as the most fundamental obligation of relationship. Jeffro and Willy are in the lives that Mountain Monsters organized around rather than replaced. The antique business, the arborist work, the Appalachian community roots whose depth the show's 8 seasons did not exhaust and whose continuity the post-show years have allowed them to return to. Their starting over is the quieter kind, the return to what was always there rather than the construction of something new. And all of them, every member of the Ames team in 2026, are living in the specific aftermath of Trapper's absence, whose complete accounting no broadcast episode and no YouTube channel and no public communication has yet fully provided. Mountain Monsters was never really about monsters. The audience that followed 8 seasons of the Ames team through the Appalachian wilderness understood that without always being able to articulate it precisely, understood that what they were watching was not primarily an investigation of cryptid phenomenon, but a portrait of a specific kind of human community whose values and whose relationships the show celebrated in the specific setting of the American mountains. The creatures were the occasion. The men were the subject, and what the men's lives in 2026 communicate about what the show was, about what 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters built in the people who made it, and what its conclusion and Trapper's death have asked those people to carry in the years since, is the completion of the portrait that the broadcast record began without finishing. The tragedy of the Mountain Monsters story in 2026 is not catastrophic in the dramatic sense of public failure or acute crisis. It is the quieter and more lasting tragedy of men whose most significant shared experience ended before they were ready for it to end, whose patriarch died before any of them had fully processed what his leadership had meant to who they were, and who have been navigating the aftermath, the grief, the financial realities, the professional dislocation, the personal costs, with the specific combination of resilience and loyalty that the Appalachian culture they came from built into them as the most fundamental qualities a person can possess. Trapper built something real, not a television show, a team, a community of men whose relationships to each other and to the mountains they investigated together were genuine before the cameras arrived and remained genuine after they left. What those men are doing in 2026 with what Trapper built is the most honest continuation available to them. They are in the mountains, they are together, they are still looking, and the man who taught them to look, whose presence in those mountains gave everything they found there its meaning, is gone in the specific way that irreplaceable people are gone, present in everything his team does, absent from all of it. The story is tragic because it is true, and it is worth telling because the men it is about deserve to have what they have carried understood by the audience that fell in love with them across 8 seasons of Appalachian creature investigation. This is what Mountain Monsters looks like in 2026, and it looks like men who loved their leader keeping faith with what he built. Mountain Monsters has been off the air for years, but the real reason production stopped has finally been revealed. This wasn't a simple cancellation. It was a forced shutdown triggered by massive lawsuits, insurance investigations, and fraud allegations that Travel Channel desperately tried to hide. Former crew members are now exposing systematic evidence fabrication, cast members suing each other over stolen money, Trapper's family demanding justice. The truth buried for years is finally coming to light. Subscribe now because what's being revealed about why Mountain Monsters really ended is darker than anyone imagined. Mountain Monsters production came to an abrupt halt in late 2022, But the circumstances surrounding that shutdown were deliberately obscured by Travel Channel and the production companies involved. What viewers were told was a mutual decision to end the series after a successful run was actually an emergency stoppage triggered by legal and financial crises that made continuing production impossible. Cast members arrived for what they believed would be a routine filming week in West Virginia, only to be informed via group text message that production was suspended indefinitely. No explanation was provided beyond vague references to business complications requiring immediate attention. Equipment trucks that had already arrived at filming locations were turned around and sent back to storage facilities. Local guides and property owners who'd been contracted for the week's investigations were told their services were no longer needed, with some never receiving the cancellation fees they'd been promised in their agreements. The chaos and lack of communication revealed a production in complete disarray, scrambling to shut down operations before information about brewing legal problems became public knowledge. Crew members who'd worked on Mountain Monsters for years were blindsided by the sudden shutdown. Camera operators, sound technicians, and production assistants who depended on the show for steady income found themselves unemployed without warning or severance packages. Several crew members later reported that their final paychecks bounced, requiring them to pursue legal action just to recover wages they'd already earned for work completed before the shutdown. The production company, Ping Pong Productions, stopped responding to phone calls and emails from cast and crew seeking information about when or if filming would resume. The silence suggested something far more serious than typical production delays or budget negotiations. Industry insiders began hearing rumors about lawsuits, insurance problems, and financial irregularities that had finally caught up with a show that had been operating under questionable practices for years. Travel Channel maintained public silence about the shutdown for months, refusing to confirm or deny whether Mountain Monsters would return. That silence was strategic. The network was consulting with legal teams about how to distance itself from the mounting scandals while minimizing its own liability exposure. Internal documents later revealed that Travel Channel executives had been aware of problematic practices on Mountain Monsters for years, but chose to ignore them as long as the show delivered acceptable ratings and revenue. The lawsuit that ultimately forced Mountain Monsters production to stop permanently was filed in October 2022 by a coalition of former crew members alleging a pattern of labor violations, unsafe working conditions, and systematic fraud that the production company had perpetrated over multiple seasons. The complaint, filed in West Virginia State Court, named Ping Pong Productions, Travel Channel's parent company Warner Bros. Discovery, and several individual producers as defendants. The allegations were damning and specific, backed by documentation including contracts, emails, text messages, and testimony from dozens of witnesses. The lawsuit's central claims focused on wage theft. Crew members alleged they were consistently paid less than their contracts specified, forced to work excessive hours without overtime compensation, and denied meal penalties and other legally mandated benefits. Production assistants reported working 16-hour days during investigation filming, but being paid for only 8 hours, with producers threatening termination if they complained about the discrepancies. The complaint included detailed records showing systematic underpayment totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars across multiple crew members over several seasons. Even more explosive were allegations about evidence fabrication. Former production assistants provided sworn declarations describing how they were instructed to plant fake footprints, create artificial claw marks on trees, and place hair samples and scat that would later be discovered by the Ames team during investigations. One former employee detailed purchasing a gorilla costume from a Hollywood effects company and wearing it during night filming while cast members pretended to hunt for cryptids. The lawsuit included receipts for these purchases, emails discussing logistics of creating fake evidence, and text messages where producers explicitly acknowledged they were staging encounters because authentic cryptid activity couldn't be relied upon to provide enough dramatic content for each episode. The unsafe working conditions allegations focused on nighttime filming in dangerous terrain without proper safety equipment, inadequate medical support during remote investigations, and pressure on cast members to continue working despite injuries and health problems. The complaint specifically cited Buck's ATV accident and subsequent filming while he was clearly impaired by pain medications as examples of production prioritizing content over crew safety. Insurance fraud allegations claimed the production company had misrepresented the nature of filming activities to obtain coverage, then filed false claims when injuries occurred. The legal warfare among Mountain Monsters cast members revealed that the Ames team's apparent brotherhood was a facade hiding bitter disputes over money, credit, and control of the show's valuable intellectual property. property. The conflicts began even before Trapper's death, but escalated dramatically afterward as surviving cast members fought over who deserved what share of residual payments, merchandising revenue, and potential future earnings from the Mountain Monsters brand. Wild Bill filed a lawsuit in 2021 against the production company, claiming he was owed over $300,000 in unpaid residuals from streaming and international distribution that his contract entitled him to receive. His complaint alleged that Ping Pong Productions had deliberately hidden revenue streams and provided false accounting statements to avoid paying cast members their contractual shares. Wild Bill's attorneys subpoenaed financial records that revealed Mountain Monsters had generated millions in revenue from Netflix licensing, Amazon Prime streaming, and international sales that cast members had never been informed about or compensated for, despite contractual provisions entitling them to percentage participation. Buck and Jeff filed a joint lawsuit making similar claims, arguing they'd been systematically cheated out of earnings they'd legitimately earned through years of dangerous work on the show. Their case included allegations that producers had created shell companies to funnel revenue away from the main production entity, specifically to avoid contractual obligations to pay cast members. The legal filings exposed how production companies exploit reality television performers through complex corporate structures designed to minimize payments while maximizing producer profits. Most bitter was the conflict between cast members themselves over merchandising rights. When Mountain Monsters merchandise, including t-shirts, hats, and collectibles, began generating significant revenue, disputes erupted about who owned the rights to the Ames team brand, individual cast member images, and catchphrases used on the show. Huckleberry claimed he'd never signed away his image rights and demanded compensation for any merchandise featuring his likeness. Wild Bill and Jeff argued they had agreements with the production company that entitled them to merchandising percentages, while Buck contended that all cast members should share equally in merchandise revenue regardless of individual contracts. The legal battles became so contentious that cast members stopped speaking to each other entirely, destroying any possibility of the team reuniting for future productions, even if the show's other problems were resolved. The insurance investigation that ultimately made Mountain Monsters production legally impossible began after Buck's ATV accident, when the production company's liability insurer received a claim for medical expenses and disability payments related to his injuries. Insurance adjusters conducting routine investigation of the claim discovered discrepancies between what the production company had disclosed about filming activities versus what actually occurred during Mountain Monsters investigations. The insurer had been told filming involved outdoor recreation and nature documentation, with appropriate safety protocols, when in reality, cast members were conducting dangerous nighttime investigations in rough terrain without adequate medical support, safety equipment, or supervision. Buck's accident triggered a comprehensive audit of all previous claims filed by Mountain Monsters production over multiple seasons. Investigators discovered a disturbing pattern. Numerous cast and crew members had filed injury claims related to filming, far exceeding the rate expected for the type of production activities the insurance company believed they were covering. Wild Bill's heart attack, various sprains and fractures among crew members, and multiple emergency room visits for injuries sustained during investigations revealed that Mountain Monsters was significantly more dangerous than the production company had disclosed when obtaining coverage. The insurance company determined that Ping Pong Productions had committed material misrepresentation by failing to disclose the true nature and risks of filming activities. They described Mountain Monsters as comparable to wildlife documentary production, when it actually involved cast members hiking dangerous terrain at night, building elaborate physical structures without engineering oversight, and engaging in activities that would require specialized stunt coordination and safety protocols if accurately disclosed. This misrepresentation potentially voided coverage for all previous claims and certainly terminated the policy going forward. Without insurance coverage, Mountain Monsters couldn't legally film. No location would grant permits, no network would authorize production, and cast and crew wouldn't work without liability protection. The production company attempted to obtain new coverage from other insurers, but once the previous carrier's investigation findings became known in the industry, no reputable insurance company would cover Mountain Monsters at any price. The few quotes the production company received for high-risk coverage required premiums so expensive they exceeded the show's entire production budget, making filming financially impossible even if they could find an insurer willing to take the risk. The legal action initiated by Trapper's family in 2023 opened a painful and complicated chapter in Mountain Monsters' troubled legacy. pitting Trapper's widow and children against the production company and network over how their deceased family member's image and legacy had been exploited since his death in 2019. The family's attorneys filed suit claiming that Ping Pong Productions had made verbal promises to compensate Trapper's estate for continued use of his image in episodes, promotional materials, and merchandise following his death, but had never formalized those promises in writing or made any payments. After Trapper died, Mountain Monsters continued airing episodes featuring him, released tribute merchandise with his image, and used his likeness extensively in marketing materials to promote new seasons, all generating revenue that his family never received a share of despite alleged promises from producers. The lawsuit argued this constituted both breach of contract based on oral agreements and violation of Trapper's publicity rights that passed to his estate upon death. West Virginia law provides that publicity rights, the right to control commercial use of one's name, image, and likeness, survive death and can be enforced by heirs for a specified period. Trapper's family claimed the production company had no legal right to continue profiting from his image without compensation to his estate, yet they'd done exactly that for over 3 years, while stonewalling the family's requests for accounting and payment. The emotional dimension of the lawsuit was heartbreaking. Trapper's widow described watching Mountain Monsters merchandise featuring her late husband being sold online and in stores while her family struggled financially with medical debt from his final illness and funeral expenses that the production company had promised to help with, but never did. She testified in depositions about producers calling after Trapper's death expressing condolences and assuring her the family would be taken care of, then subsequently ignoring her calls and emails when she attempted to discuss the promised financial support. The family's legal demands were substantial. They sought an accounting of all revenue generated from Trapper's image since his death, compensation for past use of his likeness, and an injunction preventing any future commercial use of Trapper's image until a licensing agreement with appropriate compensation was negotiated. The injunction threat was existential for Mountain Monsters because Trapper was the show's most beloved figure, and removing him from future content would eliminate much of the show's nostalgic appeal and marketability. The systematic evidence fabrication on Mountain Monsters was exposed in devastating detail when multiple former production assistants came forward with documentation proving that virtually every major cryptid encounter and evidence discovery on the show had been staged, scripted, or manipulated to create false drama. The whistleblowers provided attorneys with emails, text messages, invoices, and video footage that painted a picture of a production built entirely on deception from its earliest seasons through its final episodes. One former production assistant provided a detailed written statement describing his responsibilities during filming, which included arriving at investigation locations hours before cast members to plant evidence that would later be discovered during filming. He described creating fake Bigfoot footprints using carved wooden stamps, hanging tufts of synthetic hair purchased from costume suppliers on tree branches where they'd be noticed by cameras, and placing animal scat purchased from exotic animal facilities to suggest cryptid presence. The statement included photographs he'd secretly taken of these evidence-planting activities as insurance against potential legal liability, images that clearly showed production crew members staging the very evidence that would be presented as authentic discoveries. Email correspondence between producers and special effects companies revealed extensive discussions about creating creature costumes for night filming. One email chain detailed specifications for a realistic Bigfoot suit with appropriate movement characteristics for distance filming that cost over $12,000 to manufacture. The emails explicitly discussed how the costume would be used during Mountain Monsters investigations, with cast members pretending to encounter an actual cryptid. Invoices for the costume purchase and rental agreements for subsequent uses provided irrefutable documentation of premeditated fraud. Text messages between producers showed casual acknowledgement of the fabrication with jokes about manufacturing evidence, and discussions of which cast members were better at selling fake discoveries convincingly on camera. Perhaps most damning were behind-the-scenes video clips that production assistants had recorded on personal phones showing the reality of filming versus what appeared in broadcast episodes. One clip showed a dramatic Bigfoot encounter being filmed multiple times from different angles with a clearly visible person in a costume, followed by producers coaching cast members on how to react more convincingly for the final take that would air. The authenticity that made Mountain Monsters appealing was completely manufactured. Multiple property owners across West Virginia filed lawsuits against Mountain Monsters production, claiming trespassing, property damage, and filming without proper authorization or compensation. The legal actions revealed that producers had often filmed on private land without securing proper permits or landowner consent, relying on verbal agreements that were never formalized or compensated appropriately. One lawsuit filed by a family in Pocahontas County detailed extensive property damage caused by construction of elaborate traps and staging areas for investigations. The production had built wooden structures, dug pits, and cleared vegetation without permission, leaving behind debris and environmental damage when filming concluded. The property owners estimated repair costs exceeding $50,000 and sought compensation plus punitive damages for the unauthorized use of their land for commercial purposes. Another case involved a landowner who claimed producers had promised payment of $5,000 for location access, but never delivered the money despite filming multiple episodes on the property over 2 seasons. When the landowner attempted to collect, producers stopped responding to communications entirely. The lawsuit included text messages and emails documenting the original agreement and subsequent attempts to obtain payment. Most problematic were allegations that production had filmed in state parks and protected wilderness areas without proper permits from authorities. West Virginia Department of Natural Resources investigators discovered that Mountain Monsters had conducted filming in restricted areas, built structures in protected habitats, and violated environmental regulations regarding waste disposal and vegetation disturbance. The state issued fines totaling over $100,000 and referred the matter for potential criminal prosecution. These land disputes created additional legal and financial burdens that made continuing production untenable, while also damaging relationships with West Virginia communities that had initially welcomed the show as promoting local cryptid folklore and tourism. Travel Channel's decision to permanently end Mountain Monsters came after executives conducted a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis revealing the show had become a massive liability that outweighed any remaining revenue potential. The network faced mounting legal exposure from multiple lawsuits naming Travel Channel alongside production companies as co-defendants. Even if the network prevailed in litigation, defending against claims would cost millions in legal fees while generating negative publicity that damaged Travel Channel's brand reputation with viewers and advertisers. Ratings for Mountain Monsters had declined significantly in later seasons as viewer skepticism about evidence authenticity increased, and the show failed to evolve beyond repetitive investigation formats. The loss of Trapper had hurt viewership substantially, and attempts to continue without him proved unsuccessful at retaining audience loyalty. Meanwhile, production costs had increased due to insurance complications, legal compliance requirements, and cast member salary demands, shrinking already marginal profit margins to unsustainable levels. Network executives recognized that Mountain Monsters had become associated with fraud allegations and exploitation controversies that conflicted with Travel Channel's efforts to position itself as a credible source of adventure and exploration content. The show's reputation for faking evidence undermined the network's other paranormal programming and created skepticism among viewers about whether any Travel Channel content could be trusted. The decision was made to cancel Mountain Monsters permanently, cease all future development, and gradually phase out the show from streaming platforms and syndication to distance the network from ongoing controversies. Travel Channel announced plans to develop new cryptid and paranormal investigation programming with stricter authenticity standards, enhanced safety protocols, and transparent disclosure about investigation methods to rebuild viewer trust damaged by Mountain Monsters' troubled legacy. Wild Bill attempts independent YouTube content with minimal success. Buck withdrew from public life, managing chronic pain and working occasional construction jobs. Jeff explores other paranormal projects, but Mountain Monsters' fraud reputation makes him unhireable. Huckleberry does small-scale cryptid hunting and convention appearances for modest income. The Ames team is fractured beyond repair, members no longer speaking due to legal disputes and personal betrayals. Mountain Monsters became a cautionary tale about reality TV exploitation rather than Appalachian folklore celebration. In September 2014, the Mountain Monsters crew filmed an episode in Wirt County, West Virginia, investigating reports of the Yahoo cryptid that would never air on Destination America. Subscribe now because what the cameras captured during that investigation was so dangerous, so controversial, and so disturbing that network executives banned the episode immediately, ordered all footage locked away, and threatened legal action against anyone who discussed what happened. For 9 years, the episode remained hidden until leaked footage surfaced online in 2023. This is what really happened during the banned Mountain Monsters episode that the network desperately tried to keep secret. Mountain Monsters premiered on Destination America in 2013, following a team of Appalachian hunters and trappers known as the Appalachian Investigators of Mysterious Sightings, or Ames team, as they tracked cryptids throughout the mountain regions of West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, and surrounding states. The show featured team leader John Trapper Tice, along with investigators Jeff Headley, William Wild Bill Neff, Joseph Huckleberry Lott, Jacob Buck Lowe, and Willy McQuillian. The format combined cryptid investigation with trap building, following the team as they interviewed witnesses, searched remote wilderness areas, and constructed elaborate traps attempting to capture creatures including Bigfoot variants, the Mothman, lizard demons, and other Appalachian cryptids. By season 2 in 2014, the show had developed a successful formula and dedicated following, leading producers to become increasingly ambitious about the creatures they would investigate and the risks the team would take during filming. In late summer 2014, producers planned an episode focusing on the Yahoo, a violent Bigfoot-like creature reported in Wirt County, West Virginia, with a reputation for being far more aggressive than typical Bigfoot encounters. Local legends describe the Yahoo not as a shy forest dweller, but as a territorial predator that had allegedly attacked humans, killed livestock brutally, and defended its territory with extreme violence. Multiple witnesses had reported encounters where the Yahoo charged at people rather than fleeing, threw rocks with deadly accuracy, and made terrifying vocalizations that sounded like screaming combined with growling. The Ames team had investigated aggressive cryptids before, but the Yahoo reports suggested something genuinely dangerous rather than just frightening. Producers were aware of the risks, but believed the team's experience and the dramatic footage potential justified proceeding with the investigation. The plan was to conduct a week-long investigation in the remote Wirt County wilderness, build a large trap designed to contain something extremely strong and violent, and attempt to capture evidence of the Yahoo through nighttime tracking and provocation. What producers didn't anticipate was how quickly the situation would spiral completely out of control, resulting in injuries, production equipment destruction, and footage so disturbing that network legal teams would determine it could never be broadcast. The investigation began in early September 2014, with the team arriving in Wirt County and setting up base camp in an area where Yahoo sightings had been concentrated. Local witnesses warned them that the creature was not like other cryptids they had investigated, that it was genuinely dangerous and had put people in the hospital with injuries from thrown rocks and physical attacks. Trapper dismissed the warnings as exaggeration, confident the team's experience would keep them safe. On the second night of filming, the Ames team conducted a nighttime investigation in dense forest approximately 2 miles from their base camp, spreading out in pairs with night vision cameras to cover more ground and increase chances of encountering the Yahoo. Wild Bill and Buck were investigating a ravine area where witnesses had reported recent activity when something happened that was captured on both their handheld cameras and a static camera that had been positioned overlooking the ravine. The footage, which would later become the primary reason the episode was banned, shows Wild Bill and Buck hearing something large moving through brush approximately 50 yards from their position. Following standard protocol, they called out attempting to communicate and provoke response. What happened next occurred with shocking speed. A large, dark figure emerged from the tree line and charged directly toward Wild Bill and Buck, covering the distance in seconds while both men were scrambling backward trying to retreat. The night vision footage clearly shows both investigators falling as they tried to run, with Wild Bill hitting the ground hard. The figure reached Wild Bill's position while he was down. What the camera captured next was Wild Bill screaming in pain and terror while something off-camera was attacking him. Buck's camera shows him trying to reach Wild Bill but being unable to get close because of the figure that appears to be striking or grabbing Wild Bill repeatedly. The attack lasted approximately 15 seconds before the figure retreated back into darkness. When Buck finally reached Wild Bill, the cameras captured Wild Bill bleeding from multiple injuries, barely conscious, and in severe distress. The footage shows Buck calling frantically for help over radio, trying to assess Wild Bill's injuries while also watching the darkness in case the creature returned. Wild Bill had deep lacerations on his arms and torso that were bleeding heavily, later determined to be consistent with being struck by something with tremendous force or possibly clawed. He had a head injury where he had been knocked to the ground, and he was going into shock from the trauma and blood loss. The rest of the team reached their location within 10 minutes, bringing first aid supplies and helping to stabilize Wild Bill enough to move him. The decision was made to evacuate him immediately to the nearest hospital, rather than waiting for emergency services to navigate the remote location. The cameras captured the chaotic evacuation through dark forest, with Wild Bill being half carried by team members, while everyone watched the darkness expecting another attack at any moment. This footage alone, showing a clear, violent attack on an investigator resulting in serious injuries, was enough to make network executives extremely nervous about airing the episode, but it was only the beginning of what would make the episode unbroadcastable. Wild Bill was transported to Camden Clark Medical Center approximately 45 minutes from the investigation site, arriving in the emergency department around 2 in the morning with injuries that required immediate treatment and raised serious questions among medical staff about what could have caused such trauma. The medical documentation, which later became part of the legal controversy around the episode, showed Wild Bill had sustained 4 deep lacerations on his left forearm, ranging from 4 to 7 inches in length, 2 lacerations on his right shoulder and upper chest, significant bruising across his torso consistent with blunt force trauma, a concussion from the head impact when he fell, and was treated for shock and blood loss. The lacerations required over 40 stitches total to close. Most significantly for the controversy that would follow, the attending physician documented that the wound patterns were unusual and didn't match typical injuries from falls, animal attacks, or accidental trauma from branches or rocks. The lacerations showed characteristics of being caused by something striking with considerable force in a downward motion, creating tears in the skin rather than clean cuts or typical claw marks. This documentation would later become crucial when network lawyers were determining whether the show could be held liable for putting cast members in situations that resulted in serious injury. While Wild Bill was being treated, production supervisors were having emergency discussions about whether to continue filming or shut down the investigation immediately. The standard practice for reality television when cast members are injured is to halt production, conduct safety reviews, and only resume if conditions can be made safe. However, the remaining Ames team members, particularly Trapper, insisted they needed to continue the investigation to document what had attacked Wild Bill and to prove they hadn't fabricated the incident. This created tension between the production team and network executives who were being updated about the situation in real time. The decision was made to pause filming for 24 hours while Wild Bill was evaluated, and while producers assessed whether continuing was safe and legally defensible. During this pause, something happened that would make the episode even more controversial and contribute to it being banned. Several team members, including Buck, who had witnessed the attack firsthand, began questioning whether they should continue putting themselves at risk for a television show. Buck expressed concerns on camera during interviews that what they encountered wasn't just an animal or even a typical cryptid, but something that appeared to be hunting them specifically and targeting them with intelligence and malicious intent. He stated he believed they had provoked something that was now actively trying to hurt or kill them, and that continuing the investigation would lead to someone being seriously injured or killed. Despite Wild Bill's hospitalization and Buck's serious concerns about safety, Trapper made the decision that the team would continue the investigation after the 24-hour pause, arguing that walking away would mean the attack on Wild Bill had been for nothing, and that they had an obligation to document what was in those woods. This decision created the first major conflict in Mountain Monsters history between team members, captured on camera in footage that network executives later determined could not be aired because it showed how production was prioritizing dramatic television over cast safety. The footage shows Buck and Trapper having a heated argument where Buck explicitly states he believes continuing is reckless and potentially fatal, while Trapper insists they can take additional precautions and that they owe it to Wild Bill to finish what they started. Buck ultimately agreed to continue but stated on camera that he was doing so against his better judgment and that if anyone else got hurt, the responsibility would fall on Trapper and the producers who were allowing this to continue. Production made several safety modifications for the continuation of filming. Additional crew members were brought in to maintain visual contact between team members at all times. Medical personnel were on standby closer to the investigation site. Team members were equipped with air horns and other deterrent devices, and critically, team members were authorized to carry firearms for self-defense, something that had not been done on previous Mountain Monsters investigations. This last modification would prove to be the most controversial aspect of the entire episode, and a primary reason it could never be broadcast. On the third night after Wild Bill's attack, The team returned to the investigation area with modified protocols and additional safety measures. The plan was to set up a large trap structure designed to contain something extremely strong, then conduct nighttime surveillance and tracking to document the Yahoo's behavior and potentially lure it toward the trap. Trapper, Buck, Huckleberry, and Jeff participated in this phase, while Willy remained at base camp monitoring communications. What happened during this third night created footage that was so problematic from legal, ethical, and broadcast standards perspectives that network executives immediately ordered all footage seized and locked away. The team had been working on the trap construction for several hours when they began hearing vocalizations from multiple directions surrounding their position. The sounds were described as howling mixed with screaming, coming from at least 3 different locations in a pattern that suggested coordination rather than random animal sounds. Trapper made the decision to split the team into pairs to investigate the different sound sources, hoping to triangulate the Yahoo's location. This decision, made against the safety protocols that had been established after Wild Bill's injury, put team members in vulnerable positions separated from each other in darkness, while something that had already demonstrated violent intent was in the area. Approximately 20 minutes after the team split up to investigate the surrounding vocalizations, a gunshot rang out in the darkness, captured on multiple cameras from different positions and creating a moment that would define why this episode could never be broadcast. The audio from multiple sources clearly captured a single gunshot followed immediately by Buck's voice screaming for everyone to get to his location immediately. The footage shows team members running through dark forest toward Buck's position, with cameras capturing the chaos and fear as everyone tried to navigate through dense woods while not knowing what had happened or whether there was ongoing danger. When cameras reached Buck's location, the footage shows him standing over something on the ground with his rifle still raised, clearly in shock, and Jeff arriving moments later asking what happened. The footage, which has been described by people who have seen it, but which has never been publicly released, apparently shows a large, dark figure lying motionless on the ground, approximately 10 feet from Buck's position. Buck's account, captured on camera in the immediate aftermath, states that he was investigating the vocalizations when the figure charged at him from close range, giving him only seconds to react. He states he feared for his life based on what had happened to Wild Bill and fired one shot at center mass to stop the charge. The figure went down immediately and did not move. The footage from the next several minutes is reportedly the most controversial in the entire episode, showing the team's reaction as they approached the figure to determine what Buck had shot. Multiple cameras captured the scene from different angles as team members used flashlights to examine what was on the ground. According to descriptions from people who have seen the unaired footage, what the cameras revealed was not clearly a known animal, not clearly a person in a costume, but something ambiguous enough that it created massive legal and ethical problems for the network. If Buck had shot an unknown animal, that would create wildlife law violations and potential criminal charges. If he had shot what appeared to be a person, even if that person was in a costume and charging at him, that would create potential manslaughter or assault charges. If he had shot an actual cryptid, that would raise questions about why the body wasn't preserved and turned over to scientific authorities. The ambiguity of what was actually shown on camera made the footage impossible to broadcast without creating catastrophic liability for everyone involved. The production team made the decision to shut down filming immediately and secure the scene. Local authorities were not initially contacted, a decision that would later become extremely controversial. Instead, production supervisors contacted network executives and legal teams who began emergency consultations about what to do with the footage and how to handle the situation. In the 72 hours following the shooting incident, Destination America network executives, production company lawyers, and crisis management consultants engaged in intensive damage control to prevent the Mountain Monsters episode from becoming a public relations disaster and potential legal catastrophe. The first action taken was securing all footage from the investigation under lock and key, with explicit orders that no copies were to be made and no footage was to be reviewed without legal counsel present. All crew members present during the investigation, including the Ames team members and production staff, were required to sign expanded non-disclosure agreements with severe financial penalties for discussing what had occurred during filming. These NDAs reportedly included liquidated damages clauses in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per violation, effectively silencing everyone involved through the threat of financial ruin if they spoke publicly about the banned episode. episode. Wild Bill, who was still recovering from his injuries in the hospital, was visited by network representatives who secured his signature on similar agreements and reportedly offered financial compensation beyond his standard appearance fees in exchange for his cooperation in keeping the incident confidential. The question of what to do about the shooting itself and whether to involve law enforcement created intense internal debate. Legal counsel advised that if what Buck shot was an animal, West Virginia wildlife laws would require reporting the incident and likely result in criminal charges for hunting violations, given that the shooting occurred at night, potentially involved an endangered or protected species if it was determined to be an unknown primate, and occurred in an area where hunting may not have been permitted. If what Buck shot appeared to be a person, or could be interpreted as a person in a costume, failure to report the shooting could constitute obstruction of justice or accessory after the fact to a potential crime. The decision was ultimately made to not involve local law enforcement based on the argument that the figure had charged at Buck in what was determined to be legitimate self-defense, that no body could be located when the area was searched the following day during daylight hours, suggesting whatever was shot had retreated and survived the encounter, and that involving authorities would inevitably lead to public disclosure of the footage, which would create the exact liability exposure the network was trying to avoid. This decision, while legally questionable, was based on risk assessment that the potential consequences of reporting were worse than the potential consequences of not reporting. To justify the decision not to report, extensive searches were conducted of the area where the shooting occurred, documented through photographs and video that would serve as evidence that the network had acted reasonably in determining no crime had occurred. These searches found no body, no blood trail, and no physical evidence that anything had been shot and killed. Network executives and legal teams identified multiple independent reasons why the banned Mountain Monsters episode could not be aired under any circumstances, creating a situation where the footage became permanently locked away rather than simply delayed or edited for content. The primary legal concern involved liability for Wild Bill's injuries and the question of whether the network had exercised adequate duty of care in protecting cast members from foreseeable harm. Reality television productions have legal obligations to maintain reasonably safe working conditions for participants, and courts have found networks liable when cast members are injured during filming if it can be shown the production created or failed to mitigate unreasonable risks. Wild Bill's injuries were serious enough that if the episode aired showing the circumstances that led to the attack, it could be used as evidence in a potential lawsuit that the production had knowingly put cast members in dangerous situations for entertainment value. Even if Wild Bill chose not to sue, regulatory agencies or insurance companies could potentially take action based on the documented safety failures. The shooting incident created even more severe legal problems. Regardless of what Buck actually shot, the footage showing a cast member discharging a firearm during production raised questions about weapons protocols, safety procedures, and whether the network could be held responsible for whatever consequences resulted. If the shooting was legally justified self-defense, airing the footage could still create public relations disasters and potentially subject Buck to criminal investigation if prosecutors decided to review the case. If the shooting was not justified, airing footage documenting a potential crime would make the network complicit. The ambiguity of what was shown in the footage made it impossible to defend airing the episode from any angle. Beyond the shooting itself, the footage showing team members arguing about safety and expressing concerns about continuing the investigation would directly contradict the network's position that adequate safety measures were in place. Broadcasting Buck's on-camera statement that continuing the investigation was reckless and could lead to someone being killed, followed immediately by footage of the shooting incident, would create devastating evidence of negligence if legal action was taken. The ethical concerns were equally prohibitive. Destination America marketed Mountain Monsters as entertainment about cryptid hunting, maintaining ambiguity about whether the creatures were real or the show was staged performance. The banned episode's footage was too graphic and too realistic to maintain that ambiguity. If what was shown was real, airing it would be broadcasting actual violence and potential death for entertainment. If what was shown was staged, it would constitute fraud against viewers and potentially violate FCC regulations about disclosure of staged content in unscripted programming. Network standards and practices departments determined the violence shown was too intense for the network's target demographic and time slots regardless of context. For 9 years, the banned Mountain Monsters episode remained locked away with only network executives, legal team members, and participants knowing what the footage contained. The Ames team continued filming subsequent seasons without publicly acknowledging the banned episode, though observers noted format changes after season 2, reducing aggressive cryptid confrontations and increasing safety protocols. Wild Bill recovered from injuries and returned to the show, but was noticeably more cautious and refused to discuss Wirt County when asked by fans. Buck remained with the show but showed less enthusiasm for night investigations and became more vocal about safety concerns during filmed episodes. Then, in March 2023, partial footage from the banned episode appeared on social media platforms and file-sharing sites, uploaded by anonymous sources and spreading rapidly through paranormal investigation communities and Mountain Monsters fan groups before network legal teams could issue takedown notices. The leaked footage was incomplete and lower resolution than broadcast quality, suggesting it had been copied from production files rather than master footage, but showed enough key incidents to confirm years of rumors about why the episode was banned. The leaked material included approximately 8 minutes showing Wild Bill's attack and immediate aftermath with graphic injuries visible. The heated argument between Buck and Trapper about continuing the investigation, with Buck explicitly stating someone would be killed. Audio of the gunshot and chaotic response with team members screaming and running through darkness, and brief, unclear footage of something on the ground that viewers debated endlessly. Notably absent from leaked material was any clear view of the figure Buck shot, suggesting whoever leaked the footage either didn't have access to that specific content or deliberately withheld the most legally problematic material. Destination America issued immediate DMCA takedown notices and released a brief statement acknowledging unreleased Mountain Monsters footage had been leaked without authorization, investigating how the breach occurred, but notably did not deny the footage was authentic or address specific content shown. Ames team members did not comment publicly, presumably bound by non-disclosure agreements, though fans noted Wild Bill's social media presence decreased significantly after the leak and Buck deleted his Facebook account entirely. Jacob "Buck" Lowe was the youngest hunter on Mountain Monsters, the fan favorite who learned everything from the legendary Trapper. But when the cameras stopped rolling and Trapper died, Buck's life took a turn nobody saw coming. What happened next reveals the dark reality of what happens to reality TV stars after the fame disappears. Tonight, we're uncovering the truth about Buck's life after Mountain Monsters, and it's not what you think. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. In 2013, a young hunter from the heart of West Virginia stepped into the spotlight and changed the face of cryptid hunting on television forever. Jacob "Buck" Lowe joined the cast of Mountain Monsters as one of the original AIMS team members and immediately stood out for one crucial reason. He was the youngest member of the crew by a significant margin, while the rest of the team consisted of grizzled, weathered Appalachian veterans who had spent decades tracking through those ancient mountains. Buck brought youthful energy, raw enthusiasm, and a hunger to prove himself that viewers found instantly compelling. His personality created a perfect contrast with the older hunters. Where they were cautious and methodical, Buck was impulsive and eager. Where they relied on decades of experience, Buck relied on instinct and adrenaline, and fans absolutely loved him for it. He became the relatable entry point for younger audiences, the guy who asked the questions viewers were thinking, who reacted with genuine excitement when something unexplainable happened in the darkness. But behind the scenes, the reality of filming Mountain Monsters was far more grueling than most viewers ever realized. The shooting schedule was absolutely brutal, with the team often spending entire nights in freezing temperatures, hiking through treacherous terrain, setting elaborate traps, and staging dramatic confrontations with creatures that may or may not have actually been there. Like many reality shows, there was constant pressure to deliver compelling television, to create moments that would keep audiences coming back week after week. For Buck, being the youngest meant working twice as hard to earn respect, to prove he belonged among these legendary hunters, to show he wasn't just the kid who got lucky with a TV contract. The physical toll, the mental exhaustion, the strange liminal space between reality and performance that defines all reality television. Buck was living it all while still in his 20s, and the cracks were already beginning to form beneath the surface, even if nobody could see them yet. One of the most compelling dynamics on Mountain Monsters was the relationship between Buck and the team's legendary leader, John "Trapper" Tice. For many fans watching at home, Buck felt like the spiritual son of Trapper on screen, the younger hunter learning directly from an old-school Appalachian legend who had spent his entire life in those mountains. Trapper wasn't just the team leader. He was a father figure, a mentor, a living embodiment of Appalachian hunting culture and folklore traditions passed down through generations. And Buck absorbed everything Trapper had to teach: the way he tracked, the way he read signs in the forest, the way he approached the unknown with respect rather than just bravado. Their on-screen chemistry became one of the show's most powerful elements. Trapper would borrow bark orders and Buck would execute them without hesitation. Trapper would share wisdom about the mountains and Buck would listen with genuine reverence. It created a narrative arc that felt authentic, even within the sometimes questionable reality TV framework. Viewers watched Buck grow from an eager young hunter into a more seasoned tracker under Trapper's guidance. But it's crucial to clarify something that has caused confusion among fans over the years. Trapper and Buck were not related by blood. They were not father and son in any biological sense. Their relationship was purely professional and mentorship-based, forged through years of working together in extremely challenging conditions. However, the bond they developed was clearly deep and meaningful, transcending typical co-worker relationships. For Buck, Trapper represented everything he aspired to become as a hunter and as a man. The respect was visible in every interaction, every conversation, every moment they shared on screen. And when Trapper's health began to decline in later seasons, that bond would be tested in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. The foundation of Buck's entire experience on Mountain Monsters was built on Trapper's leadership, and when that foundation began to crumble, everything else would start falling apart as well. As Mountain Monsters progressed through its later seasons, viewers began noticing something troubling. Trapper's appearances became less frequent, his energy noticeably diminished, his usual commanding presence fading gradually. Behind the scenes, the truth was becoming unavoidable. Trapper was dealing with serious health issues that were progressively limiting his ability to participate in the grueling filming schedule. The show tried to work around his declining condition, giving him less physically demanding roles, allowing him more rest between shoots, but the reality was clear to everyone involved. The man who had been the heart and soul of AIMS was slowly slipping away. Then in December 2019, the news that everyone had been dreading finally came. John Trapper Tice passed away, leaving an enormous void in the show, in the team, and in the hearts of fans who had followed his adventures for years. The announcement devastated the Mountain Monsters community. Tributes poured in from around the world. Fellow cast members shared emotional statements about losing their friend, their leader, their brother in the woods. But for Buck specifically, losing Trapper hit differently. While we can only speculate about the depth of his personal grief, it seems almost certain that this wasn't just a TV moment for him. This was the loss of a mentor who had shaped his entire adult life, who had taught him not just how to hunt, but how to carry himself as an Appalachian man. For Buck, who had spent years in those dark woods by Trapper's side, learning his methods, absorbing his wisdom, building a relationship that went far beyond scripted television, that loss was almost certainly deeply personal and profoundly painful. Grief has a way of amplifying every other struggle in a person's life, and for someone already navigating the unstable world of reality television, the death of Trapper likely represented more than just losing a colleague. It meant losing the anchor that had kept everything together, the steady presence that had made all the chaos and uncertainty worthwhile. Mountain Monsters ran for 8 seasons, building a dedicated cult following of cryptid enthusiasts, Appalachian culture fans, and people who simply enjoyed watching a group of colorful characters hunt impossible creatures through dark forests. But like many reality shows, it ended somewhat abruptly in 2020, leaving viewers with unresolved cliffhangers and unanswered questions about the team's ultimate fate. For the cast members, the sudden ending meant facing an uncertain future. The regular paychecks stopped. The visibility disappeared. The structure that had defined their lives for years simply vanished overnight. But Buck wasn't ready to let the legacy die. In late 2024 and into 2025, something unexpected happened. Buck, along with fellow AIMS members Huckleberry and Wild Bill, launched a new project that represented both a continuation and a reinvention. They created Sons of Appalachia, a YouTube-based series that would continue the cryptid hunting tradition while explicitly honoring Trapper's memory and the methods he had taught them. This wasn't a major network production with significant budgets and guaranteed viewership. This was 3 hunters with cameras, trying to keep the dream alive through sheer determination and passion for what they did. Sons of Appalachia represented a very different kind of challenge. Instead of fighting creatures in the woods, they were now fighting algorithms, competing for attention in an oversaturated digital landscape, trying to build an audience one video at a time. The production values were lower, the resources were limited, but the authenticity was arguably higher than it had ever been on cable television. For Buck, This new chapter meant taking control of his own narrative, steering his own career, and ensuring that everything Trapper had taught him wouldn't be forgotten. It was both inspiring and somewhat tragic. Here was a man who had achieved legitimate television fame, now reduced to scraping for views on YouTube just to continue doing what he loved. The transition from cable star to digital creator is a journey many have taken, but few talk about how difficult and humbling that fall can actually be. For many reality TV hunters in Appalachia, life after the cameras stop rolling can turn dark incredibly fast. This is a pattern we've seen repeated across countless shows and countless lives. Brief fame that feels enormous in the moment. Small paychecks that seem significant until they stop coming. No residuals, no royalties, no financial safety net for when the show ends. And then reality hits with brutal force. Bills that don't care about your television credits. Health issues that don't wait for your next opportunity. Mental health struggles that intensify in the silence after years of constant production chaos. And absolutely no support system from the networks that profited from your labor and your image. The entertainment industry has a long, documented history of chewing up working-class participants and spitting them out once their usefulness expires. This is especially true in reality television, where participants often lack the contracts, protections, and representation that scripted actors receive. They're not considered talent in the traditional sense. They're considered content, raw material to be extracted and exploited until the audience loses interest. For someone like Buck, coming from a small Appalachian community where opportunities are already limited, the whiplash of sudden fame followed by sudden obscurity can be psychologically devastating. We've seen this pattern over and over. The reality star who ends up broke, addicted, homeless, forgotten. The person who was on television one year and in a county jail the next. The familiar face who quietly disappears and nobody thinks to ask what happened to them. There is absolutely no public record that Jacob Lowe has gone through arrests, overdoses, or homelessness. But if he had, it would fit a well-known and well-documented pattern for reality TV's forgotten stars, particularly those from economically disadvantaged regions who were never given the tools or support to navigate sudden visibility and its inevitable disappearance. What we actually know about Jacob Buck Lowe's personal life is relatively limited, which is probably exactly how he prefers it. The documented facts paint a picture of a man deeply rooted in his Appalachian heritage. He's originally from West Virginia, born and raised in the mountains that would later become his television hunting grounds. His background before Mountain Monsters involved hunting and fishing, traditional Appalachian outdoor skills passed down through generations of mountain families. These weren't hobbies for Buck. They were survival skills, cultural practices, a way of life that connected him to the land and to his ancestors. In 2018, during the height of Mountain Monsters' popularity, Buck married Christine Stein, marking a significant personal milestone amid the chaos of reality television production. Marriage itself is challenging under normal circumstances, but balancing a marriage with the demands of a public persona and dangerous night shoots in the woods creates pressures that most couples never have to face. The constant travel, the physical danger, the strange schedule, the public scrutiny, the financial uncertainty. These are stressors that can destroy even the strongest relationships. Beyond these basic biographical facts, Buck has maintained relative privacy about his personal life, which makes sense given the invasive nature of reality television. He's not active on social media in the way many reality stars are, constantly sharing personal details and private moments. He's kept his family life, his struggles, his triumphs largely away from public view, and that restraint deserves respect. What we can say with certainty is that Buck represents a particular type of Appalachian man: tough, resourceful, connected to tradition, suspicious of outsiders, fiercely loyal to his community. These qualities made him compelling television, but they also make him someone who likely struggles with the performative aspects of modern fame. The constant need to share, to engage, to commodify every aspect of your life for public consumption. For someone raised in mountain culture where privacy and self-reliance are deeply valued, the demands of reality television and digital content creation probably feel fundamentally unnatural and exhausting. Here's where we need to be absolutely clear and honest about the limits of what can be verified about Buck's life. There is no verified public information that Jacob Buck Lowe spiraled into addiction after Mountain Monsters ended. There are no credible reports that he lived in his truck, homeless and desperate. There are no documented stays in recovery housing or rehabilitation facilities. These narrative elements, while they fit common patterns for reality television participants, are not confirmed aspects of Buck's actual life story. and should not be presented or accepted as biographical fact. This distinction matters enormously. It's easy to construct a tragic narrative that feels plausible, that aligns with what we know happens to many people in similar circumstances, that creates compelling content. But plausibility is not the same as truth, and patterns are not the same as individual experience. Buck deserves to have his actual story told, not a fictionalized version that serves a predetermined narrative arc. What is absolutely real, however, is the environment Buck exists within. Appalachia's devastating opioid crisis is well documented and has destroyed countless lives across the region. The economic stress facing working-class communities throughout West Virginia and surrounding states is severe and worsening. The way reality television fame can magnify every existing crack in a person's life, turning manageable problems into catastrophic failures, is proven across countless examples. So while we don't know Buck's specific struggles, we know the context he's operating within is brutal. We know the pressures he's facing are real. We know that even if he's avoided the worst outcomes, he's almost certainly fought battles that the public will never see or understand. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Buck's relative privacy might indicate he's handling everything well, or it might indicate he's struggling privately. We simply don't know, and we shouldn't pretend we do. So what actually happened to Jacob Buck Lowe after Mountain Monsters? The documented facts tell a story that's less sensational, but perhaps more genuinely interesting than manufactured tragedy. Buck remained a main cast member through all 8 seasons of the show, never getting fired, never quitting, never disappearing mysteriously. He was there from the beginning in 2013 until the show's conclusion in 2020, a 7-year run that represents genuine consistency and professional commitment in the notoriously unstable world of reality television. Then, after a period of relative quiet following the show's cancellation, Buck resurfaced publicly as one of the 3 core members of Sons of Appalachia. Alongside Huckleberry and Wild Bill, he's now leading a new cryptid hunting series that launched in 2025, explicitly designed to continue Trapper's legacy and keep Appalachian monster hunting traditions alive for a new generation of viewers. In one sense, what happened to Buck is tragic, but in a different way than typical reality TV horror stories. This is the tragedy of diminishment rather than destruction. A beloved cable television star, someone who appeared in millions of homes, who had genuine fame and recognition, now reduced to fighting YouTube algorithms just to stay visible, trading network production budgets for whatever equipment they can afford, building audiences one subscriber at a time instead of inheriting established viewership. This is the reality for most television personalities once their show ends. The industry moves on instantly, viewers forget quickly, and yesterday's star becomes today's struggling content creator, desperately trying to remain relevant in an attention economy that has already moved past them. But there's also something admirable and resilient in Buck's journey. He didn't give up. He didn't fade away quietly. He didn't let Trapper's death or the show's cancellation end his connection to the work he clearly loves. He adapted, evolved, and found a new path forward, even if that path is harder and less glamorous than what came before. We don't know every detail of Jacob Buck Lowe's private life, and we shouldn't pretend we do. Speculation presented as fact helps no one and disrespects the actual human being behind the television character. But his journey from small-town hunter to cable TV star and then to YouTube survivor sits on top of a much bigger, darker story about what reality television does to people once the cameras go dark. The real monsters aren't cryptids hiding in Appalachian forests. The real monsters are systemic, addiction that preys on economically devastated communities, grief that compounds when you lose mentors and father figures, guilt over not living up to expectations, not capitalizing on opportunities, not becoming what everyone said you could be. The entertainment industry's exploitation of working-class people for profit without providing long-term support. Buck's story, whatever its specific details, represents thousands of similar stories. Reality TV participants used and discarded. Appalachian communities strip-mined for content the same way they've been strip-mined for coal. People whose humanity gets reduced to narrative arcs and clickable content. If there's a lesson here, it's about maintaining skepticism toward the reality television industry's promises and practices. It's about recognizing that every person we see on screen is a complete human being with struggles we'll never fully understand. It's about demanding better treatment and support for the people who create the content we consume. And it's about remembering that when we ask what happened to someone, we're asking about a real life, not just a story.